Pay close attention. What you're about to see is Bible prophecy being fulfilled.
Welcome to another edition of YPN News, bringing you the news that relates to Bible prophecy and foretold by Yeshua Hawkins. Well, in the news this week, Turkey strongly disagreeing with the actions of one of its NATO allies, the United States. Also, President Trump making one of his most important speeches of the year, the State of the Union. Well, these stories and many more, but first, the outrageous cost of prescription drugs. Now, in his State of the Union speech, President Trump called lowering prescription drugs a top priority. Lawmakers are considering a bill to address legal but questionable tactics that drug companies use to delay introduction of cheaper generic medications.
The FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb has called the tactics, quote, shenanigans and unfair and exploitative practices. Where drug companies have been playing games to hold off their competitors who usually make a less costly generic version of the drug. This allows the huge drug companies to maintain exclusive sales and their high profits.
In a CBS News This Morning interview, Pam Holt says her copay for Revlimid, a drug used to keep her multi-myeloma blood cancer at bay, costs $640 a month. She says, I don't know how anyone can afford that. I really don't. But Holt can't get a generic because other companies aren't trying to make one.
Revlimid is one of a number of drugs for which no generic drug has been made because of the unfair tactics used to block other companies. So just what are these games drug companies are using to protect their profits? Rutgers law professor Mike Carrier explains those games take many forms. In one form, a brand company will pay a generic to delay entering the market. In another form, it will switch from one version of a drug to another, just trivially different. Well, just to take or keep generics off the market, he says they call it a cycle life management or a life cycle management. He said, I call it anti-competitive conduct. So all this in the hopes of maintaining their profits and keeping the generic manufacturers from coming on the market as well.
That's right. Manipulating patents is another tactic of drug companies. Even though the government gives exclusive right to companies to sell their drug for 20 years, drug makers have found ways to extend it by using what they call a patent thicket of sometimes more than 100 additional patents. Drug companies can easily claim infringement against anyone attempting to copy their particular drug.
Well, another tactic to block competitors is by product hopping, where a company will make minor changes to a drug, such as switching from a capsule to a tablet or changing the dosage. Each change would force a generic to redesign the product and get approval, in essence, delaying any similar drug from entering the market.
Well, some drugs, like Pam Holt's drug, Revlimid, are classified in a special group of high-risk drugs. Now, competitors must acquire samples from the original manufacturer, Celgene, to produce a generic form. However, if the original maker refuses to provide samples, they are indirectly blocking patients from accessing the generic forms because other companies don't have or can't get the drugs to copy them in order to produce a generic.
Right. Well, Pam Holt commented, I'm just learning that now, so that is devastating to me. Sick people should not have to increase the profits of these huge drug corporations.
Well, how are drug companies responding to these claims? Lori Riley with industry's lobbying group Firma believes the system is working. She said 90% of all medicines are generic, over 1,000 new ones approved just last year, the highest anywhere in the world, and over 100 billion worth of new medicines going off patent in the next 5 years. I think our system, by and large, has worked tremendously well.
Well, Pam Holt has decided to fight the drug companies by joining the group Patients for Affordable Drugs. When asked, "Does this make you angry?" she responded, "Yes. And it's just so very irritating and so very heartbreaking that there's so little being done to help us."
Well, at least 45 million people tuned in to the 80-minute-long State of the Union speech by President Trump. Conservatives are praising the president on both his speech and first year in office. Now, Trump laid out plans for immigration and a boost in infrastructure spending after taking credit for gains in the economy.
President Trump said, "Tonight I'm calling on Congress to produce a bill that generates at least $1.5 trillion for the new infrastructure investment that our country so desperately needs." As we mentioned earlier, a top priority of the president is lowering prices for those prescription drugs for Americans. And President Trump said in his speech, "One of my greatest priorities is to reduce the price of prescription drugs. That is why I've directed my administration to make fixing the injustice of high drug prices one of my top priorities for the year."
House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi was not impressed with the president's speech, saying it was a very transformative speech for some of us last night because our expectations for greatness and vision of the president are not high. He stooped to a new low in terms of how he dealt with issues.
Wow. Jeff, statistics show that every family in America will be affected, of course, by the prescription drug at one point or another in the next few months. So for Trump to say he's going to lower drug prices this year is a really big deal for those families, like the one lady that we just mentioned who pays over $600 a month for just one prescription. And it's exactly what people like Pam Holt are waiting for.
Well, but Katrina vanden Heuvel, editor of The Nation magazine, says she's not holding her breath. She reminded RT's Ed Schultz that, quote, "Trump is a different beast. But he's also embedded in an extremist Republican Party, which has refused to allow the government to negotiate with drug companies on drug prices."
So will President Trump really be able to make a difference with Big Pharma? Vanden Heuvel doesn't think so. She says he can say one thing one day, and there's a lot of malleable truth in Trump's persona. But she adds, this administration is AWOL on the opioid crisis. Do you know that in 2016 there were more opioid overdoses than there were combat deaths in Vietnam? And that was a tremendous amount of opioid deaths that even we reported on many times throughout the year, being on the rise throughout pretty much almost every major state in the United States.
Well, one other thing we've talked about this year is the vaccinations for the flu that has hit pretty hard. Larry McGee is covering a story on a special vaccine that's only available to the military. Larry, what do you have for us?
As liberal social behavior continues to rage, so too does the increase in debilitating diseases, with aggressive mutations surfacing faster than the medical community can develop and market concoctions to address them. Such is the case with adenovirus, a disease newly come up that mimics a lot of the symptoms typically associated with the flu. Unlike the flu, however, there is not a common vaccine for this latest arising, and while that might make some more conscious citizens cheer, it is a strong source of concern for others. Symptoms of the virus include high fever, body aches, and sore throats, and cases are reportedly surfacing all across the country. The only way to determine conclusively whether or not one is saddled with the pathogen is to be tested, but even if a person was found to be afflicted, the only vaccine available is restricted to military use only. There are efforts afoot, however, by advocates for vaccination to have the potion made available for public use to address the outbreaks that officials say could strike year-round. The fighting and retaliatory blows being struck by so-called allies is beginning to make many people question what exactly is the difference in today's world between an ally and an enemy. And a prime example of that sort of confusion is the current relationship between the United States and Turkey. A new war front has opened up in the west of Syria, where Turkey and its supporters are combating mercenaries backed by the United States. The brawl is taking place in Afrin, which is an area controlled by Kurdish forces, which are the bitter enemies of Turkey, but that the U.S. presently has on the payroll. Ankara has named their efforts Operation Olive Branch and stated for the public that the move is not an invasion of Syria, but is instead an action designed to protect Turkey's borders from the Kurdish militia in northwest Syria. There have been heated words delivered by President Erdogan over the matter, who in one statement accused the U.S. of building an army of terror along its borders. America insists, however, that the mercenaries of the YPG have been an asset in the fight against ISIS and offer the Kurdish role in reconquering Raqqa as case evidence. To that, President Erdogan has vowed to push the activities in Afrin east to Manbij, which will bring Turkey into direct conflict with U.S. forces who are situated there operating with Syrian Kurds. Despite that, the commander of U.S. forces in the Middle East released a statement saying that American troops will not be withdrawing from Manbij. In a bid to promote understanding, the Turkish ambassador to the U.S. sat down with journalists this week where he was asked why his government was so concerned about and against the soldiers of the YPG. The ambassador began by offering a comparison for the sake of perspective, where he mentioned the infamous 9/11 attacks and the fatalities sustained by the United States during that event. He then said that while Turkey has not endured as many deaths on one single day as those caused on 9/11, over the course of the last 3 decades, Turkey has lost 40,000 Turkish citizens as a result of attacks conducted by the PKK, including men, women, and children, and some security officials. On the question of whether or not Ankara has regard for the perceived effectiveness of YPG fighters against ISIS, the ambassador stated that in going after Daesh, America is dealing with the symptoms and not the cause. Ultimately, the Turkish diplomat suggested that the current conflict between the U.S. and Turkey boils down to strategy. As far as Turkey is concerned, you cannot successfully fight with the terrorist organization by making use of a terrorist organization. YPN News, I'm Larry McGee. Katan Jeff, back to you.
Katan, it's interesting to hear the Turkish ambassador's comments regarding the YPG and the PKK, just to see how different it is from what the U.S. has been claiming.
That's right. Well, the civil war in Syria has been going on for over 6 years, and over 500,000 people have died in its wake, and several terrorist groups have formed during this time as well. Well, the U.S. and other nations, including Kurdish fighter groups, have stepped in to try to help stop the fighting and eliminate groups like ISIS. With the war and terrorist groups waning, Turkey is now turning its focus on the Kurds. So the question is, what does the U.S. do? Abandon the Kurds or fight Turkey? Because remember, the Kurds were helping in the fight against ISIS there. And the problem with them abandoning the Kurds or fighting Turkey is one of the NATO members. So it's not likely that they could actually do so.
Well, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Peters spoke to Fox News regarding the dilemma, and he said that we could push to suspend NATO, or Turkey's spot in the NATO group. He continued by saying Turkey has been a long-time frenemy to virtual enemy, and I guess that's been kind of a friend and kind of an enemy at the same time, right, to an all-out enemy. Peters said that Erdogan has destroyed Turkish democracy, has Islamized the country, backs the Muslim Brotherhood, and put thousands of political opponents in jail, crushed the local media, and now he's attacking America's best ally in the Middle East outside of Israel.
Well, Peters continued, we have no long-term strategic goal in the area, and after decades of failure, we still imagine that we can be an honest broker. Honest brokers don't exist in the Middle East, he said. You pick a side and stick to it. Well, referring to a little history, Peters said that the borders in those countries, the Middle Eastern areas, were drawn by greedy Europeans for their own purposes and in ignorance of local conditions. Yeah.
Well, after months of fighting off Daesh, Syrian opposition groups finally pushed them out of their self-declared capital in Raqqa. Now, after the liberation, SDF forces displayed posters of militant leader Abdullah Öcalan, the imprisoned former leader of the PKK terror group. This was a sign that many of the fighters were fighters of the YPG, the Syrian branch of the PKK. Well, the U.S. considers the PKK a terrorist organization, but has been providing weapons to its Syrian affiliate.
That's right. President Erdogan said in an address concerning Operation Olive Branch that some of our allies say that we haven't been providing weapons to terrorist groups, but we have evidence, he said. Who are you cheating? These are all known facts. Erdogan has had difficulties, of course, persuading the U.S. that the two groups are the same terrorist organization, but the U.S. has been putting the YPG under the umbrella of the SDF to disassociate the two. This didn't, of course, prove that the two organizations weren't related, but merely showed that all of this was just an elaborate branding exercise by the United States. So it's kind of the name game.
Yeah. Well, U.S. Special Commander General Raymond Thomas spoke actually of how they came up with that name. They call themselves the YPG, and Turkey equated that to the PKK and said, you're fighting with a terrorist organization. How could you do that? So the general continued, we told them they were going to have to change their branding, and they came back with the name the SDF, or the Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, the general said, I thought it was a stroke of brilliance to put democracy in there somewhere, but it gave them a little bit of credibility, but not with Turkey. And of course, the democracy is the whole reason that the U.S. is fighting, so they picked a name there that definitely meant something to the United States.
Tickled their ears, that's for sure. Now, the U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson warned Latin America in a recent speech that they should stay away from what he called Chinese investment, as China is now the biggest trading partner of Chile, Brazil, Peru, and Argentina. While there are some benefits, the unfair trading practices have harmed many in Latin America in the field of manufacturing, labor, generating unemployment as a result, and lowering wages for workers. He warned Latin America that they should stay away from Chinese investment, European colonialism, and Russian weapon sales.
He warned the nations that the region does not need another imperial power. Now, the U.S. is getting more concerned as the three nations are beginning to gain a major foothold in Latin America, which used to be a major U.S. backyard for decades.
That's right. Jason Greenblatt, an assistant to the President Trump, U.S. President Trump, is meeting with the Middle East Quartet in Jerusalem, meeting with the Quartet envoy while he's there. The purpose is to bring everyone up to speed on the peace plan and what the U.S. has developed and when it might be presented. They're wondering what needs to be done to bring the Palestinians back to the negotiating table, but a part of the problem is that out of the four members of the quartet, no one trusts each other, which of course makes finding a solution to peace very difficult.
Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas spoke at the Council of the European Union, saying that Palestine considers the EU a true partner and friend, and called on the EU to swiftly recognize the state of Palestine and reconfirm that there is no contradiction between recognition and the resumption of negotiations.
Federica Mogherini spoke afterwards, assuring Abbas of the EU's firm commitment of the two-state solution with Jerusalem as shared capital of the two states, the state of Israel and the state of Palestine. And of course, we can see here, Jeff, with all that has been reported in the news in the last several months, there is definitely a problem of trust among the nations. And of course, if two nations that don't trust each other go to sit down at a negotiating table for the purpose of bringing peace, well, where are we right now? There's nothing that's actually going to be accomplished.
That's right. And as what we saw with just the quartet, they themselves don't trust one another. Very hard to think that they're ever going to accomplish something like global peace when there's not a basis to build off of.
That's right. Well, if you are looking for a way to peace, if you are looking for a way to restore trust within your life and within your community, there is a solution, and that is called the Peaceful Solution. You can find out more about the Peaceful Solution by going to www.peacefulsolution.org. And to find out more about what you can do to start to bring peace and reduce the chaos in your life, as well as what you can do to bring health and peace to your family and to your neighborhood, you can contact the House of Yahweh. And when you do, don't forget to request your free copies of the monthly newsletter and the Prophetic Word magazine. Here's how.
To contact the House of Yahweh, you can write them at the House of Yahweh, P.O. Box 2498, Abilene, Texas 79604. You can call them at 1-800-613-9494. Visit them at any of their websites, Yahweh.com, YisraelHawkins.com, or Yahweh'sBranch.com. You can also visit our website at YPNnews.com. If you would like to email the House of Yahweh, you can email them at info@yahweh.com. Any international calls, you can call the number that's on your screen. And don't forget the two greatest Bible tools on the market today. They're absolutely free: the Yisrael Says program and the Ask Yisrael program. You can find out more about these two extraordinary programs by going to YisraelSays.com and AskYisrael.com.
Well, up next, a voice that you really can trust, Yisrael Hawkins. From all of us here at YPN News, I'm Katan Alexander.
And I'm Jeffrey Heimerman.
Thank you for joining us.